There's really two kinds of MCP servers, like one that you can run locally on your computer, and that's like downloading the executable and running it locally. Like you've really got to trust that. And then there are remote MCP servers where you connect to an MCP server over the network, over HTTP. And that has its own set of security issues. And that's where the MCP specification has matured recently in coming up with authorization possibilities that fit better into an enterprise setting. In the end, this question doesn't matter because for marketing purposes, we're going to leverage the word agent to mean everything. And so it's really going to water down what it even means. I think it's going to be as commonplace as calling something a service, right? Okay, that could be just about anything, right? And so I think that's probably where we'll end up. But I tend to think of this closed loop controller thing as being an agent.
Welcome to the API Docs podcast. And I welcome two of my guests today, Kevin Swiber and my other guest, Kristof and Tomme. Kevin, you probably know from the internet or from conferences. He's a very seasoned API thought leader with a strong background in architecture, specification, and community-driven standards. And he comes to us with extensive experience with over a decade in API-focused startups, previous roles at Apigee, Postman, Stripe, and contributions to a lot of architecture, software engineering, DevOps, infrastructure management, and so on and so forth. And I hope that you are reading his latest posts about how MCP's APIs all the way down. And I think the latest one that I have seen was about the architectural examination of model context protocol, right?
Yep.
And nowadays you work as senior API strategy lead and technical evangelist at Layered Systems, focused on API governance, product strategy, and go-to-market. Right?
Yeah, I work across lots of API strategy things. I work with enterprises on their API strategy internally. I work with API product companies on like marketing and positioning and their own product strategy. And I also work with investors who are looking to invest in the API space, helping them evaluate the market and evaluate companies. Although lately, a lot of the work that I've been doing is around MCP.
Let me introduce my other guest, who is Kristof and Tomme, a recurring guest in this podcast. He is the CEO of Pronovix and a host of the API Resilience podcast. One of the viewpoints that Kristof is bringing is Drupal, which is not the Drupal that you knew, but the Drupal as of 2025 and how that might connect to Model Context Protocol and why this is all awesome. But in your role as consultant, Kevin, what are the questions today that you are getting from the perspective of MCP and agent to agent? And we know a lot about what is the theoretical potential and the frontier, but then there's the reality. What are the questions that now you are getting towards actual execution?
I think there are two sides to it. There's the business value question, and then there's the risk mitigation question, right? Definitely, when we think about like natural language interfaces and plugging into them, MCP has become pretty popular in technical audiences, right? So a lot of developers are doing it. It hasn't necessarily reached a lot of business users yet. And even the interfaces into that through like a Claude desktop or something are still fairly technical, like updating a JSON document, right? Which isn't something that typically we want to push onto business users. So we've got a lot of technical audience who's really interested now in how do we extend that natural language interface experience for our business users. For them, it's really the first time that they get to play in this AI space, right? They might not be data scientists. They might not have a lot of knowledge of machine learning, but now with MCP, they can start plugging in. If they know how to build an API, basically, they can start plugging into that experience. And so there's this kind of push out from the technical audience of how do we actually leverage this for our business users, and how do we let them know that this is like an opportunity for us. And then, of course, because it is taking off on the technical side, there's a lot of concern from security folks who are saying like, oh, you can plug into any random server on the internet and then start sharing your chat experiences. And, oh, you could potentially plug into our database of clients and then maybe accidentally send that information out to a public MCP server. Like, how do we start mitigating all of this risk. Really, those two sides, it reminds me a little bit of, not quite as big, but it reminds me a little bit of when mobile devices started becoming very popular and everyone started bringing them to work. And then security folks had to figure out, oh, the CEO now wants to put their mobile device on the network. How do we support bring your own device to work? A similar thing is happening there where like the popularity of MCP is becoming so big that it's putting pressure on security to say, okay, like how do we really enable these folks to do this in a secure way? So it's an interesting kind of intersection between those two things, but I think really healthy growth along the way. So lots of questions from investors on MCP and what does that mean? And particularly if they were investing in the API product space before, what does this mean for my investment? How should they respond to these market changes? But lately I've been working with product companies who are building tools in the MCP space. And so through that work, not only interacting with them and helping to build their systems, but also meeting with their customers and understanding the problems that they're having there or the opportunity that they're looking to achieve. There's a lot of overlap in kind of the API space too, because as we've seen a rise of platform teams who are taking a lot of responsibility for API management across the organization, these platform teams are now looking at how they can enable MCP across the organization as well.
There was a more or less sound agreement around 2025 April-ish on when it comes to MCP. It's the Wild West, and it's comparable to when we're downloading executable files to our computer and just running it. And then I think a week or two later, a new standard came out that did resolve some of the authentication issues. Did that change everything that you were telling about MCP up until that point or not?
No, so there's really two kinds of MCP servers, like one that you can run locally on your computer. And that's like downloading the executable and running it locally. Like you've really got to trust that. So that's like one set of security issues. And typically those things are doing things like accessing your local file system or accessing something that's local to you, a Git repository, whatever it might be. And then there are remote MCP servers where you connect to an MCP server over the network, over HTTP. And that has its own set of security issues. And that's where the MCP specification has matured recently in coming up with authorization possibilities that fit better into an enterprise setting. When they launched, they didn't necessarily have that enterprise use case in mind, but then the community responded very quickly and said, hey, we really have to mature this so we can actually use it in our organization. And then the spec authors were really open to that community and made some changes very quickly, which is certainly helping with adoption. We've seen OpenAI adopt MCP since then. It originated at Anthropic. We've seen Microsoft adopt MCP. We've seen Google say yes to MCP. So the maturity is almost required for these folks to continue to offer products in this space.
Kristof, what do you hear from clients or from interested parties asking you for strategic information on, okay, how do I react? Do I even start thinking of it? Or what is the question that is top of mind mostly with people you're talking with?
I think right now customers are still very waiting. It's a little bit too scary still. But they're I had one enterprise customer who was asking so next year we're going to do this MCP project. Can you give us advice on how do we put that into our portal, or how does that relate to our portal? And then is that just another interface for our API infrastructure, or how does that work exactly? And it's for me, MCP means the paradigm that makes us work very differently. For large language models, they're making us much more conscious about context. Before it was about access control, can you prevent access, people from accessing the wrong stuff? Now it's more about, okay, so we have this context and I've got this other context, and how can I bridge from my corporate context where I have access to certain information to some remote context where I can make certain things happen, and how do I bridge that? That I think is really fascinating. It can change how authoring works, and for example, and that's one of the areas that I'm really excited about. But context. I don't know what you think about this, Kevin.
Yes, I think most of the folks I'm talking to who are adopting MCP right now, they're definitely early adopters, and they're definitely what we used to call web native companies. So like the company didn't even start before the web was around, right? And so they were born on the web. So they've got at least a lot more comfort with this sort of thing than say a 100-year-old company might who's going through a digital transformation. That said, I think even these companies are looking at having AI as a consumer of their content. And so the question comes up of how do we make, we've got a website, right? We've got documentation, we've got marketing materials. How do we make this be more easily consumable for someone who's coming from a chat GPT or a Claude desktop, right? They might not be using the web browser to get to our site anymore. They might be using a chatbot of some kind or a chat assistant of some kind. And so it's interesting when we think about documentation really and how the consumption of documentation is going to have a new avenue. I won't say it's going to completely change from what it is today. Having a chat interface next to you, you can have all sorts of personalization around that for you, your own preferences, your own style of how you learn information and how you take in information. And now, like you're accessing a traditional API developer portal, for instance, might have to present that information in a slightly different way in order for it to be consumed. And there are a couple of standards around this right now. There's LLMs.text, which basically allows you to have markdown versions of your site. But I think we'll probably see more growth around this as time goes on.
So we've implemented LLMs.text for Drupal. We've open sourced that as a recipe in Drupal now. Also with the Markdownify, which is rendering your content as Markdown, like whatever formatting you have, just stripping it out. So we like the third-party consumption or third-party large language model related services that might be consuming your content. I think that's a really big one that is coming. And then also it enables first-party LLMs, and the LLMs you control or the services that are consuming your content mediated through large language models.
Yeah. Ironically, the large language models do much better with XML, and we've moved away. We've spent so much time moving away from XML that now Markdown is like the in-between. You don't necessarily have all that documentation context that you would have with even HTML today, or some of the other documentation formats that exist out there that allow you to annotate your content in certain ways. That's super helpful for consumption. We'll see how that impacts the consumption side for folks using like the chat GPTs out there. I'm wondering if we will start to see some like additional markup come into play to help with that consumption side, because I'm not sure Markdown is going to go all the way.
I've been joking. I've been asking a friend who used to work on the semantic web 15 years ago. There was this big wave in the Drupal community for making a semantic web version of Drupal, like with RDF tagging and all of that stuff. And this enormous amount of effort went into making Drupal semantic web ready. And then it didn't really pick up as much. There was like some usage in SEO, but it did not really become the thing that it promised to become. So I've been thinking like, hey, like actually right now, with what's happening right now, actually, if you have like, you can tag your information, and that capability would actually be useful and might help with some of these, what you're describing, like that LLMs can look at the XML and do more with that than just with plain Markdown.
Yeah, and I think that there's actually probably more advanced ways to pull in external content into your chat interface than what we have today for MCP, which might be like offering you tools or prompt templates or other resources. I haven't really seen any sort of documentation tools around that. People are usually discovering these things by just connecting a server and like seeing what tools it brings back. But that isn't great for discovery, right? And being able to find the kind of tools that you want to use. So I think eventually we're going to have to figure out documentation for MCP, what that looks like. Today, I haven't seen anything out there that even attempts to auto-generate documentation from MCP servers.
I see the technical writer side where there's a huge interest because everyone can feel that this is point of no return. Okay, but then what do you learn? What is the new thing that needs to be learned, be that this hard skill or a mindset in which you understand what else needs to be documented if it's not only APIs or the business concept or the business solutions that these APIs offer, but like when it comes to agents, MCP servers and agent to agent and all of this interconnectedness, where does the context end of what you have to document, and how big is this that needs to be all together? And where is the security guideline? I think this is a really big problem.
And I think it's not like with APIs where you were documenting API. So the documentation and the API were separate. Now, runtime and documentation time are intermingling, and the documentation you have actually affects your runtime. So it's a different documentation paradigm that I think that we need. It's not disjoint.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that there's more than one consumer of this documentation now. So there's the person who's going to implement this. This might be an end user, it might be a business user who's looking to add tools to their chat experience. It might be a developer who's looking to expand their automated AI workflow to take advantage of MCP. And in addition to that, like human consumer, you've also got the machine consumer who needs natural language to understand what's going on. And the words that you'd use to describe what the tools do to a human might not always match the words that you would use to describe it to the machine, which could need it in a different format or could need additional information that the human really wouldn't want. And documentation could potentially become bifurcated here, where we're documenting not only for humans, but we're documenting for the LLMs as well.
There's another aspect to it also, because this is like what documentation can do for MCP like adoption and for MCP effectiveness, but there's also what can MCP do for documentation and how can it help people to be better at documenting or to be faster or to like generate drafts, extract information from a business context and things like that. At the IDOcs, we had some people talk about some of this. What have you heard people doing before?
Yeah, as folks are connecting all their document management systems to their chat experience, right? So if that's a Google Drive, sometimes it's linear as like an issue tracking system. They were early with an MCP server. Sometimes it's GitHub. If you're able to like pull in all of these different sources and combine them contextually for you to help come up with documentation. And typically when working with that chat experience, you're working with the LLM to generate some kind of document together. And so like you're definitely leading the way there instead of just relying on the LLM to come up with everything, because I don't think we're there yet, right? I don't think we could just send the LLMs off to write everything for us and it'll be high quality. I haven't seen that yet. So you're definitely orchestrating everything that's happening here. And it is a huge benefit to not go and like copy paste from all over the world and even use these MCP tools to help discover maybe some documents you didn't know existed that are actually relevant to what you're doing. You know, I definitely see folks who are doing that. I'm not sure I speak to a lot of docs writers who are doing that, but certainly folks such as PMs or business analysts who have to write some kind of documentation, not necessarily for end users, but for someone in the business or for a developer team, they're certainly taking advantage of the ability to pull in all this context.
Like I personally have been really, so one of the biggest tools I'm using is Notebook LM, because it's great at creating like a controlled, large context that you can then go and interact with. Like the ability to like search across a whole bunch of documents and then extract a structured overview of that, and then being able to do things with that's really powerful. I think like in business context, being able to do an interview and then I use that as, I did that with a customer, just took a voice recorder and then uploaded that and then used that to extract like strategy insights and what did we discuss and what was like the next step. And that's been really powerful. I think for like interviewing subject matter experts, I think that this could be really like a big game changer where you don't have to go through all your notes. You can just ask the bot to tell you what did we discuss and then start building up the content that you need to build up. So I think that I'm really excited about that. And then the other thing I'm excited about is, and here's the Drupal piece that I would love to pick your brain on. The AI initiative itself is doing a lot of work to make all these actions that you have inside of the CMS available for agentic flows and whatever. So I'm really excited about like MCP as a potential API layer for Drupal, where you have your CMS context that you can even configure your whole system or do really advanced complex things, setting up approval flows and whatever, using the affordances that are already there, but then that are now exposed through as tools through MCP. So I'm really excited about that part. Do you see that also happening in other CMSs? And everybody's trying to build MCP servers now, but what I'm curious about your perspective, or one of my fantasies is that maybe this helps this old CMS to leapfrog the API first CMSs, because it's like it's an internal context that's being exposed rather than something that was an external surface that is being repackaged in an MCP server. Is that just me daydreaming about what this could mean for Drupal, or how do you see that?
So I usually tell people we need to leverage the assets that we have, right? And so if you've already got APIs and you're trying to build an MCP server, certainly leverage what you already have to do that. However, it is a different interface, right? Like the MCP server is not necessarily exposing everything that you would want to expose over the API, maybe not at the same granularity even. And so if you have an opportunity to build an MCP server from scratch, you get to start with that whole interface and figure out what that would look like. Now, maybe you're building an API behind that as well, which would not be too uncommon. But just the simple fact that you potentially could design an interface for this use case specifically, yeah, I think if the natural language experience is going to become big for people using CMSs, being able to design for that specifically could potentially leapfrog competition there. But yeah, I think it is important to identify that this is a different interface, and folks are starting to see if they've got an API and they do some kind of automatic conversion between an open API description to an MCP server. Sometimes they end up with like 100 different tools in their chat experiences, and LLMs have a really difficult time with that. They can't handle that many tools. And so they're realizing like, oh, we actually need to design for this experience specifically and for these constraints specifically. So yeah, I think the maturity there is going to take a little while, but it did for APIs as well, right? We talk about API gateways. A lot of API gateways started as API facades on top of legacy technology, but now it's APIs kind of all the way through for most people. Not everyone, but for most people it is. And so I think just the new interface for MCP is an interesting challenge for folks who are designing systems.
So going back to context, so are you creating a set of contracts at the boundary of your system, or are you creating a set of contracts that allow you to act inside of the system? I see a lot of value for LLMs at the boundary of deterministic systems where they help with the translation to humans. I am worried about trying to automate with an LLM itself. I think there's safer ways. So the probabilistic way of doing another try and like maybe matching, I can see the appeal of that, but I worry that's not going to be very efficient, and it's going to cost a lot of compute and also cause problems. So I see it more like a productivity tool that helps you to bind two contexts together in a very specific way, and that transforms what you have here into something that you have there, which is similar to APIs, but it's different because APIs are like the workhorse of automation and of doing this in a deterministic way, where I see this LLM or the AI version more of a delightful experimentation to see, like, can I make it work? And that can be very valuable, because it's like if you're able to pull up a document from like a haystack, from a corporate haystack, it can be fantastic. If you're able to process it and get something out of it that you can then review, that's also amazing. Do you want to trust it to do it every single time? I think, yeah, there I see the role of LLMs more as a little bit of translation sauce that's mixed in a very constrained workflow to make sure that you don't go off the rails.
Yeah. There are really like two sides to this too, right? Like ChatGPT had such great consumer market penetration that everybody knows ChatGPT now. So
Yeah.
they want to start taking advantage of that. But then you've got what's been happening with LLMs in the sort of technical community, and folks certainly experimenting there. I've definitely built AI automations that keep looping and costing a lot of money and not really getting any higher quality when we go through the eval, right? I think there is a lot more maturity that needs to happen on the AI automation side. And that almost different problem, I think. And even in that space, I think there are a lot of people who are either in one camp of saying, well, we should use MCP for everything in that space. And there are other people who are saying, well, I already have access to the database directly. I already have access to my APIs directly. Why would I go through MCP if I'm running this in some back-end automation? So I think that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But this sort of the consumer opportunity in some ways and in some places is overshadowing what I'm seeing in certain businesses around the AI automation stuff. There are certainly people who care about that and are using large language models for that. But I think the impact isn't as obvious, I think, to business users as using a consumer technology like ChatGPT or Claude Desktop or something like that. So there's definitely two flows that are happening right now in development teams who are wondering, how do we take advantage of the AI ecosystem that's being built?
Yeah, and I wonder it feels like this one-off automation, that is what is really powerful for. It's not a standard process, but you have affordances that you can have a chance as it. That feels very powerful. I think that there's some translation at the edges as part of a bigger workflow. That is where I see the power. I think that the thing that I think confuses a lot of people is that AI is being portrayed as true artificial intelligence, that is a conscious, intelligent thing that is as good as a human at doing a job. And I think that is soon, very soon, is going to be like that. And I think that confuses this, because then you're looking at that as the orchestrator, like AI as the orchestrator, rather than AI as the translator. And I think that causes a lot of confusion, because I think if we would focus on AI as a translator between human input or unstructured inputs and a more structured world, that it would cause less problems. This is my understanding, or how I look at it.
Yeah, I think you want to limit the amount of probabilistic patterns that you have in your system, because even evaluating that is really difficult, as opposed to something that's deterministic, where you can evaluate the quality fairly easy and it's predictable. I think we want to use LLMs, at least for that consumer use case, because they're not as predictable, because they might give me new insights into my ideas. And I think there is a lot of value there, especially when we talk about people whose job it is to write documents. Being able to get some insight into another perspective that can enhance your document or your documentation is really great. But to not have that human orchestrator there, and to say, have this automatically go through all of my code and all of my assets and come up with some human documentation, we're not there yet. At all. And if you're doing that, you're probably putting out something that is much lower quality than if you had a human there kind of directing everything. Yeah, these things tend to start going off the rails after a while. Even with AI coding assistants, if you just let it go and do its own thing, you might end up in a place that's really strange and not where you wanted to go when you first started out. And the same is true for documentation as well. You can end up in some really weird corner. And so that human benefit of being there is certainly going to be needed for the foreseeable future. And I think it's just a matter of learning how to leverage these AI tools to be more productive in our lives, as opposed to looking at how do we replace these jobs altogether.
Yeah. Kevin, as a bit of a rounding up, but the long rounding up, looking from the perspective of a competent documentarian team who are sitting on a medium t-shirt sized knowledge base, and they see the potential in exposing this knowledge base without too much security issues, other than they don't want it to be changed by an outside agent, but they don't have security restrictions. They're happy if someone reads that. So they would like to experiment with new possible potentials, allowing certain agents to fetch whatever they want from there. What would be your warnings or guardrails that, as an architect, that they should certainly have in place before they start experimenting? Otherwise, they'll be dragons.
Yeah, I would say definitely start with these consumer-facing tools to prototype, and you don't necessarily start down the agent path of trying to automate all of this stuff. One of the benefits of having MCP now is that we can really connect to all these systems and pull in all this information. And so really being able to experiment with like your prompts and how to get the right sort of information from the LLM using something like a ChatGPT or a Claude Desktop today is probably going to be a much better experience. And I think a lot of developers do that as well when they're trying to engineer their prompts. Yeah, and I think if we're just talking about documentation in a closed system, I probably wouldn't worry too much about security there and risk mitigation, and would probably focus more on that value side on what we're actually getting out of it. So I would definitely say now is the time for experimentation. Go and try it out. And if you find a pattern that is pretty repeatable and good, then let's start automating that. I think another interesting thing too for documentarians who might be a little bit more technical is the ability to use like coding environments for some of this stuff as well. I've used Cursor, which is an AI enabled IDE, and Anthropic models, Claude, to do lots of documentation and planning. And what's interesting there is that it becomes like a little bit cheaper to experiment and say, hey, like let's go along this line of thinking and let's generate documentation along this line of thinking. And then you get to look at it and say, oh, this is effective or it's not effective without really investing that much of your time. And then, of course, if it is effective, you can invest more time in making that better. But being able to do that kind of experimentation is a huge value. And these AI coding assistants can actually do that pretty well because they're just using large language models under the hood, the same ones that you're using in ChatGPT and Claude Desktop. If you're comfortable using an IDE environment for editing your documentation, then certainly look at what GitHub Copilot, Cursor, and really all these different options that are out there today. Look at what they can actually do for you.
How would you, if this was one of your clients, how would you know that they're completely way deep in the rabbit hole and they're far away from actual commercial usability at this moment?
I think when you start spiraling out too much on the technical automation side of things, you need to like pull it back a little bit. There are certainly like use cases, and it's fun to automate things, right? I love automating things. I do it all the time. It's super fun, but there might be more value in having something more deterministic or having something, utilizing something that's already built that you can start using today. But I think if you're going down this rabbit hole of like, how do I build these complex AI automation systems for a use case that can maybe just be handled by using a ChatGPT, maybe it's time to pull it back a little bit and say, maybe we're not there yet. There are certainly use cases for that, plenty of them out there, and people are doing this very much so today. But I think there's a lot that can be accomplished without taking a huge investment on the technical development side.
Yeah, this was an off question because documentarians are known to be pragmatic by and large. Where was that? I read somewhere on LinkedIn. Is there something LLM or whatever agent and the documentarian? No, a linter will do that for you. Don't worry. Yeah.
And I think development teams need to take some advice from those documentarians sometimes, because sometimes the linter is just fine and you don't need an LLM to tell you that you're missing a semicolon.
Yeah. Kristof, where do you see this current thin layer of experimentation that from the ground up is worth doing because there's immediate use cases for it?
So I think that I need to still go through all of the recordings we have from AI the docs, because I think there's some people that are like already doing interesting things. But I think this, how we use it day to day today already in our company, like making summaries, then compiling a bunch of summaries and like extracting patterns across summaries, and then doing transformations of those. That's, I think, where I see a lot of value. And then like I see MCP as the bridge maybe between systems, so that where you're creating these individual pieces of content, that you then can send them over to a system for storing or for representation and for publishing. That's how I currently am imagining it. But we need to do experiments. We need to see what works, what doesn't work. It's very interesting times for sure.
Last surprise question, maybe to Kevin, from the devil's advocate. Is it automation or is it really like agent? I think API Days Munich last week, one of the terrific presenters said that currently it's very magical. So we call it AI. The moment we figured it out, we're going to call it software.
Yeah, I think you can use the word agent for a lot of things. And I used to work in IoT. I built a whole IoT product, and we have these sort of IoT automations. And I would think of those as agents as well. I tend to think of it as an agent if there is like a closed feedback loop, which is like a control theory thing. But if you're sensing something from the environment, you're taking some kind of action, or you're analyzing that, and then you're taking some kind of action that impacts that environment. I think we can call that an agent and be just fine. I think because in the end, this question doesn't matter, because for marketing purposes, we're going to leverage the word agent to mean everything. And so it's really going to water down what it even means. I think it's going to be as commonplace as calling something a service, right? Okay, that could be just about anything, right? And so I think that's probably where we'll end up. But I tend to think of this closed loop controller thing as being an agent.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Kristof. And I hope to meet you soon in one of the events, either on this side of the pond or another. And looking forward to the big new revelations coming our way, see what we make of it. So thank you very much for being our guest today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you for listening to the API Docs podcast. We thank our colleagues at Pronovix Developer Portals for letting us work on this, and the entire API community for all of the mutual support and sharing of experiences that you give each other. Do you have a topic or guest that you would like us to spotlight? Drop a note at podcast@pronovix.com. If you go to the website api-docs.org, you can find the recaps and recordings of past API Docs conferences, as well as the upcoming program. Until next time, be well.